August 2nd, 1939. Nassau Point, Long Island, New York. Albert Einstein picked up his pen and began writing the letter that would change the world, and he wrote it with the particular heaviness of a man who understood exactly what he was doing and understood that not doing it was worse. The letter was addressed to President Franklin Roosevelt. It described, in language that Einstein had worked carefully to make accessible to a non-scientist, the theoretical basis for an atomic bomb and the possibility that Germany was already working to build one. It warned that uranium of sufficient purity, if concentrated in a sufficient quantity and subjected to a sustained nuclear chain reaction, would release energy of a magnitude that existing weapons could not approach. It warned that a bomb based on this principle, if it could be built, would be capable of destroying an entire city. Einstein signed the letter and gave it to his friend and colleague Leo Szilard, who had been urging him to write it for months. Szilard, a Hungarian physicist who had fled Nazi Germany and who understood the German scientific establishment's capabilities from the inside, had concluded that the only way to prevent Germany from building an atomic bomb first was to ensure that the United States built one sooner. Roosevelt received the letter in October 1939 and convened a small advisory committee to assess whether the physics Einstein had described was real and whether the weapon he had described was achievable. The committee's assessment was cautious. The physics was real. The weapon might be achievable. The timeline was uncertain and the cost would be enormous. The urgency that transformed the assessment from cautious interest to the largest scientific and industrial project in human history came in December 1941, when Pearl Harbor made the question of what Germany might develop in the next year not an abstract concern but an immediate strategic problem with potentially decisive consequences. The Manhattan Project, named for the Manhattan Engineer District of the Army Corps of Engineers that initially administered it, was formally authorized in the months after Pearl Harbor and became the most extraordinary combination of scientific genius and industrial capacity that the world had ever seen. In less than 3 years, it would do what Einstein's letter had described as theoretically possible and what every expert assessment had described as the most difficult scientific and engineering challenge in history. To understand what the Manhattan Project accomplished, you have to understand what it was attempting in the context of what was known about physics in 1942. The theoretical basis for atomic weapons had been established through the work of dozens of scientists over the preceding decades, and the theoretical papers had been published in scientific journals that were accessible to anyone who could read them. German scientists had published the key papers on nuclear fission in 1938 and 1939. The knowledge that a bomb might be possible was not secret. What was not known, what could not be determined from theory alone, was whether the practical problems of building such a weapon were solvable with the technology and materials available in the 1940s. Those problems were formidable. They included the enrichment of uranium to the purity required for a nuclear chain reaction, a process that required separating isotopes that were nearly identical in mass using methods that had never been demonstrated at industrial scale. They included the design of a weapon that would bring the enriched material together in the right configuration at the right speed to trigger the explosion rather than simply scattering the material. They included the engineering of components to tolerances that the manufacturing capabilities of the era had never been required to achieve. Every one of these problems, in the assessment of most scientists who reviewed them, would require years of research to solve even with unlimited resources. General Leslie Groves was given unlimited resources and told to solve them in 3 years. Groves was 46 years old, a career Army engineer who had just supervised the construction of the Pentagon, the largest office building in the world, built in 16 months on a budget and schedule that most construction experts had called impossible. He was not a scientist. He was an administrator and an engineer and a man who understood how to organize large numbers of people toward a complex objective and how to apply resources to overcome obstacles that would stop a less determined or less capable person. He was exactly the wrong person to direct a scientific research program and exactly the right person to build an atomic bomb. Groves understood immediately that the scientific talent required for the Manhattan Project could not be coerced or commanded. Scientists who believed that a problem was impossible would not solve it regardless of how many resources were applied. What he needed was scientists who believed the problem was solvable and who were motivated by something beyond the military necessity that Groves represented. He found that combination in J. Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist from Berkeley whose intellectual brilliance was matched by an organizational capacity that his colleagues found surprising in a man who seemed to embody the absent-minded professor archetype. Oppenheimer understood the physics of nuclear weapons at a level that few other scientists could match, and he understood the human dynamics of scientific research at a level that Groves respected and could not replicate. The combination of Groves's organizational ruthlessness and Oppenheimer's scientific leadership produced the Manhattan Project's distinctive character, a scientific research program that operated with military discipline and a military project that operated with scientific flexibility. The combination was unprecedented, and it was necessary, because the problem they were solving required both qualities simultaneously. The facilities that the Manhattan Project built to solve the uranium enrichment problem were themselves achievements that would have been remarkable independent of their purpose. The electromagnetic separation plant at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, designated Y-12, was the largest building in the world when it was completed in November 1943. It covered approximately 500,000 square feet and housed 1,152 electromagnetic separators called calutrons, each one designed to separate uranium-235 from uranium-238 using magnetic fields. The building consumed more electrical power than the city of Philadelphia. The workers who operated the calutrons at Oak Ridge, many of them young women recruited from rural Tennessee and trained to operate the equipment in days rather than the months that normal industrial training required, did not know what they were producing. They knew they were doing important war work. They knew that their product had to meet purity standards that the quality control systems measured continuously. They did not know that what they were separating was uranium or that it was destined for an atomic bomb. The secrecy of the Manhattan Project was the most comprehensive information security operation in American history. Approximately 130,000 people worked on the project at its peak. The number who understood what the project's overall objective was could be counted in the hundreds. The people at Oak Ridge knew their specific tasks but not the purpose. The workers at the plutonium production facilities at Hanford, Washington, knew they were working with radioactive materials but not what those materials were being produced for. The security that kept this information compartmentalized was both the most impressive and the most ethically complicated aspect of the entire enterprise. Los Alamos was different. The scientists and engineers at the New Mexico laboratory that Oppenheimer directed knew exactly what they were building. They had been recruited from the best universities and research institutions in America and Europe, many of them refugees from Nazi persecution who had come to the United States specifically because Nazi Germany had made it impossible for Jewish scientists to work. Enrico Fermi, who had achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in Chicago in December 1942, was there. Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist whose theoretical work had been foundational to the entire field of nuclear physics, was there under the code name Nicholas Baker. Hans Bethe, Edward Teller, I. Arabi, and dozens of other scientists whose names would fill the history of 20th century physics were there. They worked with the urgency of people who knew that Germany was pursuing the same goal and who understood what it would mean for Germany to achieve it first. The German atomic weapons program was the shadow that fell over every calculation at Los Alamos, the reason that the security was so tight and the hours were so long and the pressure to solve the next problem before the week was over rather than taking the month that conventional scientific research would have allocated was so relentless. What the Manhattan Project scientists did not know until late in the war was that the German atomic program had effectively collapsed. The strategic bombing of German industrial facilities, the flight of Jewish scientists from Germany, and the German High Command's failure to allocate sufficient resources to a program whose results were uncertain had left the German program far behind American efforts. By 1944, American intelligence had determined that Germany would not have an atomic weapon before the war in Europe ended. The scientists at Los Alamos were told this. Most of them kept working anyway, because by 1944 the focus had shifted from Germany to Japan, and Japan was fighting with a determination that made every estimate of the cost of invasion look conservative. The device that was tested at Trinity site in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945 was a plutonium implosion weapon, the more technically complex of the two bomb designs that Los Alamos had developed. The simpler uranium gun-type weapon, Little Boy, had been tested sufficiently through calculation and component testing that the scientists were confident it would work without a full-scale test. The plutonium implosion weapon, Fat Man, required a test because the implosion mechanism that drove the plutonium into a critical mass was an engineering achievement of extraordinary complexity that could only be fully validated by detonating it. The Trinity test was the most significant scientific event of the 20th century. The fireball that rose above the New Mexico desert at 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945 was the first nuclear explosion in human history. The yield was equivalent to approximately 21,000 tons of TNT, roughly equal to the entire bomb load carried by 2,100 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. Oppenheimer, watching the fireball from the observation bunker, recalled a passage from the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, said something less literary and more immediate. Now we are all sons of bitches. Both men were right about what had happened. Neither of them was fully right about what it meant, because what it meant would not become fully clear for weeks and decades and the rest of the century. The bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th were the operational use of what Trinity had demonstrated was possible. The decision to use them rather than continue the conventional bombing campaign or proceed with the invasion of Japan was made by President Truman on the basis of assessments that projected American casualties in an invasion at between 250,000 and 1 million and Japanese casualties that were larger by an order of magnitude. The bombing of Hiroshima killed approximately 70,000 people immediately and another 70,000 by the end of 1945 from radiation and injuries. The bombing of Nagasaki killed approximately 40,000 immediately and another 40,000 in the months that followed. The total death toll from both bombs was approximately 200,000 people, the vast majority of them civilians. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, 9 days after Hiroshima. The surrender that ended the Pacific War without an invasion preserved the lives of the American soldiers who would have died in that invasion. It also preserved the lives of millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians who would have died defending the home islands against a ground assault that American military planners had estimated would require 18 months and would produce casualties on a scale that exceeded everything that had happened in the Pacific War to that point. The Manhattan Project accomplished in less than 3 years what the scientific consensus of 1939 had considered theoretically possible but practically uncertain. It did so by applying American industrial capacity, organizational discipline, and scientific genius in a combination that no previous human effort had achieved and that produced a result whose implications human beings have been living with ever since. The 130,000 people who built the atomic bomb at Oak Ridge and Hanford and Los Alamos and dozens of other facilities across the country were as diverse as the country that sent them to work. Young women from rural Tennessee operating electromagnetic separators without knowing what they were separating. European refugee scientists working 16-hour days in a New Mexico laboratory. Army engineers managing construction projects that dwarfed anything they had previously attempted. Security personnel maintaining the most comprehensive information security operation in American history. They were Americans in the particular sense that the word means when it is used to describe what the country is capable of when it decides to do something, which is to say that they were people from everywhere and every background who were pointed at a problem and told that solving it mattered and who solved it. The German scientists who had been working on atomic physics in 1939, who had published the papers that Einstein cited in his letter to Roosevelt, who had given the world the theoretical foundation for the weapon that ended the war, had been scattered by Nazi persecution and the failures of the German program. The Japanese scientists who understood nuclear physics had not been given the resources or the industrial support that the problem required. The American scientists had been given everything they needed. And what they produced in 3 years in the New Mexico desert changed every calculation about war and peace and the relationship between nations that human civilization had made since the first stone was thrown at the first enemy. They built the bomb. It worked. The war ended. That is the whole of the Manhattan Project, in the sense that those 3 sentences contain everything that matters about the outcome. What they do not contain is the weight of everything that followed, the decades of nuclear tension and nuclear proliferation and nuclear strategy that the bomb created, the ongoing conversation about whether using it was right or necessary that has continued for 80 years and shows no signs of resolution. Those questions are real and they deserve serious consideration. But they are separate from the question of what the Manhattan Project accomplished, which is what this story is about. The Manhattan Project accomplished what Einstein's letter had warned was necessary. It built the weapon that ended the war. It did so in 3 years with 130,000 people and $2 billion and the combined scientific genius of a generation of researchers who understood that what they were doing mattered beyond anything they would do for the rest of their careers. They were right about that. The bomb worked. The war ended. And the world that came after was different in ways that nobody who stood in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945 watching a fireball rise above the horizon could have fully anticipated, though Oppenheimer's borrowed words suggested that at least one of them understood that what had happened was irreversible in ways that went beyond the specific military calculation. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. He was not wrong. But the destroyer of worlds was also the thing that ended the war that had been killing hundreds of thousands of people every month for 4 years. It was both of those things simultaneously, and it has been both of those things ever since. That is the Manhattan Project. That is what 130,000 Americans built in 3 years in the desert and the mountains and the factories of the American interior, in the most extraordinary scientific and industrial achievement in human history. They built the bomb that ended the war.